So the next section here is about teaching civics. Um, Teaching civics education prepares students to be effective citizens, voters, and members of their communities, by providing students with an understanding of how democratic processes work, as well as how to engage in these processes and participate in the civic life of their communities. It often includes classroom instruction in government, history, and law, as well as components involving current events and service learning. So, according to the 2018 Education Week study, most states embed civics into their teaching standards and leave the school districts to determine how to package civics instruction. Still, not all states require high school students to take a year long civics or government class in order to graduate. And it shows. According to the Joe Foss Institute, a nonprofit focusing on educational programs to prepare young Americans as voters and informed community members, only one third of Americans can name all three branches of government, and only one fifth can name at least two rights granted by the Declaration of Independence. So, at the post secondary level, concern about the nation's anemic civic health prompted the US Department of Education to work with the Global Perspective Institute, now Global Perspective Institute, GPI, and the Association of American Colleges and University to assess the status and vibrancy of civic learning in colleges and university and determine how to animate education for democracy as a 21st century outcome of college. So there's a Center for the American Progress reports that the policy that has gained the most momentum in this standard that requires a high school student to pass U.S. citizenship exam or a version of it in order to graduate. Critics maintain that the exam does little to measure comprehension of material and creates an additional barrier to high school graduation. Supporters reason that students should need to meet to pass the exam if immigrants must pass the exam. And studies demonstrate too few students given the test pass it. So we'll talk a little bit more about, I'll finish with this paragraph here. The Joe Foss Institute and its affiliated Civics Education Initiative have inspired over 30 states to establish civics proficiency requirement for high school graduation, half of which have adopted some form of citizenship exam in those requirements. The initiatives additionally includes lesson plans and interactive online curriculum that promotes deeper understanding of civics concept. The Civic Education Program at the Philanthropy Roundtable has also compiled a list of more organizations promoting civic engagement and education projects, including many that provide middle and high school students opportunities to learn about civics and government and to engage in civic leadership activities. So there's also on Khan Academy, there are several units on government and civics. The thing is, and I think for mothers, is to really understand what is being taught and when. And I think by the time you realize it, it's too late to make a difference. And I've lived through it with my kids in middle school and now graduating in high school and realizing they didn't really learn a whole lot about specifically about civics and even being able to pass the exam. So
Well, my kids have been fortunate enough because the beginning of this brief talked about classical education. And
yeah,
so where my kids go to school is a classical school. So, they're studying the Minoan culture, Athens, Greece. They're running all the way through that. So that's an integral part of that. And those poor kids have been cursed with having me as a mom because they have to, I'm always asking questions about, okay, what would you be doing here and so forth. But I think this is part of where educators play a big part of the love of history, right? If you have a really great teacher who is passionate about this topic, that is contagious for kids. And I think it's really important. I think we sideline sometimes the humanities and history going, and I know STEM is important, don't get me wrong, but I think we have to understand where we've come from and why we value that so much, because I think then that determines where we go in the future. So I agree with you. I think sometimes it can be a little too late
Yeah,
for
when we realize it's important, or I feel like there's missed opportunities to incorporate some concepts of civic engagement throughout the curriculum. It doesn't necessarily have to be, it has to be one course, but it can also be part of the social studies course where you're not just looking at the news, you're also looking at what's the role of citizens in here, what are the government structures, and always you have to repeat it multiple times. It can't just be one study, one discussion on the three branches of government in eighth grade and a visit to DC, and you're like, check the box, done. So,
right. No. Well, and civics engagement is not political. It doesn't everybody thinks if you mention that, well, then it's political. And no, it's not. It's an understanding, as you said, the framework in which we work under. And then you can look at differing ideas on that framework and then you make your decision. But it's alarming when you think kids can't tell you what the three branches of government are. That's
yeah,
just, you know,
yeah. So why don't you take on the civic citizenship academies?
local leaders are in charge of developing policies and initiatives that impact the day to day lives of citizens in their communities. But lack of communication between residents and municipal leaders is common and often leads to confusion or misunderstandings. Opportunities to bridge those gaps and foster a deeper sense of appreciation are powerful means of engagement. And one such method is through citizens academies, featured on the International City County Management Association website. ICMA is an association of professional city and county managers and other employees who serve local governments. A Citizens Academy is a course or program that teaches residents about their local government and encourages them to engage by supplying residents with clear and reliable information about government services and developing their community leadership skills. These citizen academies are often organized by city management, such as boards of county commissioners, administrators, and community involvement and affairs coordinators. In communities across the country, local governments and residents serving on boards and commissions teamed up to form their own citizen academies to teach residents how their communities function and encourage residents to engage and communicate with municipal leaders. In Massachusetts, the Citizen Academy prompted community residents to serve on community committees and boards. In Ohio, mistrust of the local government was replaced by greater understanding and more frequent interactions between municipal leaders and residents. In North Carolina, residents came away with a better understanding of city planning, investments, projects, and resources. In Pennsylvania, local business owners and even college students have participated in Citizens Academy sessions to learn how residents can further engage in their communities. It is this kind of civic engagement that reflects a capacity for constantly bettering our environments.
I think this is really interesting, and it's a really interesting concept, and I think one that would be a great one to spearhead in a city, in a community, certainly in Chicago. So increasing voter participation. So that's a whole other topic. According to Archon Funk, professor of citizenship and self-government at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, the vote is the most fundamental act of American democracy, and yet very few of us actually turn out to vote. Funk believes a goal of 80% participation is the equivalent of the moonshot for American democracy. Policy solutions include education initiatives and for people where and when to vote. Some have also called for declaring Election Day a national holiday. Others suggest moving elections to weekends would be far simpler than an entire day off during the week. And a day off would not be necessary if voters had more opportunities to get involved, such as through mail-in ballot system in all states or by implementing automatic or same-day voter registration across the country, which is a really controversial kind of issue. And we have a brief on election integrity and all of that, what that entails. Besides policy initiatives, changing civic culture also plays an important role as not only a part of civic responsibility, but also a key part of promoting equality and making government responsive and restoring trust in government. Voting embodies civic engagement. Yet many view voting as a chore rather than a celebration of democracy. In the private sector, More companies are getting involved to change that view and make voting easier and more convenient. Democracy Works launched a campaign to give employees election day off, and 300 companies pledged to enact policies that ensured employees at least had time to vote. Uber and Lyft have also offered free or discounted rides to polling locations on election day to ensure barriers like lack of transportation are not an issue for voters. The U.S. Elections Project explores in-depth U.S. voter participation, and the Center for American Progress Increasing Voter Participation in America further explores policy to drive participation and make voter more convenient. Voter turnout is a big issue, and that's one way of engaging is really getting young people to register to vote, informed, making them informed voters. I know my daughter is going to try to start a policy circle with first-time voters in her high school. But Kim, perhaps you have other ideas given all your involvement and everything.
I think kids model what they see modeled at home. And so I think it's really important as parents. I mean, if kids don't see their parents voting, I think they don't see the value themselves. As I mentioned, we're in this COVID-19 crisis here. I went back and I looked at what the voter participation was in electing the county commissioners in our area. It was like 16%. 16% of the people in the community that I live in made the determination on who was now closing down their stores, deciding how their kids would be educated. I mean, and I think that was a jolt for everyone.
Yeah.
Because I think there was a disconnect between that really doesn't impact me, so I'm not going to bother with it. It impacted everyone. So I truly believe, I mean, the whole behavioral concept of when you follow data, I will be interested to see how this pandemic changes the way people view voting.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's right. That's right. Because especially the decisions that are being made on our behalf, and even here in Illinois, our representatives are not even meeting. So we don't even have a representation.
Right.
So the next section is what you can do. And the first part is about starting a policy circle. Could be a very first step to better understanding the issues. And just briefly, the policy circle, the model is that you read a brief, very much like this one, and you engage in a roundtable discussion. Ideally, a circle is started by 3 people, 3 women, who each invite one person. So you're 6. Then each invite one person, and that's 12. So you have a small group that's nimble, that can meet in different places. And the goal is to divide and multiply. The participant in your circle will then find a passion, find allies, may engage on an issue in a specific way, or may decide to focus their policy, their focus on a very specific issue that's in their lives. But it all starts with a conversation and with education, and the policy circle also becomes a forum to really invite city officials, city managers, experts to heighten your education. So there's other steps, and maybe we can go down to kind of putting conversations to work. And there's different steps here that are described in terms of your civic engagement. And I invite you, everyone, to read. And one of the things that came out here is one of the first steps to become a civic leader is to go through this very intentional kind of roadmap or path of civic engagement. And it kind of starts with, does your community know your name? Right? Do your neighbors know you? Do the owners of neighborhood shops, do you know them? Do religious leaders know you? Do the parents and the parents of the kids where your kids go to school know you? Kind of who knows you? And maybe, Kim, you could talk to that, the importance of just knowing your neighbors and your block. And civic engagement is also organizing the ice cream social in your neighborhood.
Exactly. And I think this goes back to knowing what your gifts are. I think we are all uniquely gifted. And, as I read through all of these things and we think about engagement, for some of us as women, We will never, ever put our names on a ballot. That's just not the way we're wired. But you know what? We have the gift of hospitality. Well, guess what? You partner with another friend who wants to run for office and you have the gift of hospitality. You open up your home and bring in a bunch of people who you're connected with, then you are investing in that person. And I think then you become kind of that's the person who knows a lot of people. And if you're ever going to run for office, you need to get to know her because she is very well connected. And so I think we just have to look at what our gifts and skill sets are. I also think if you talked about building relationships, you just have to be really authentic. If we're engaged in the lives of our kids, if we're engaged in the person who's living next door, I will say that's another thing that's been interesting. The people who you've had conversations with during COVID-19 are typically people you probably wouldn't have. I mean, not because you didn't like them or what, but everyone was so busy. So this has really just forced us to stop a little bit, find out about your neighbor, find out what's going on. And I think you just genuinely pour into people. I think you also have to be part of organizations. I mean, you look at a place of worship where you take your kids. There's always places that you can be involved in your local school district, whether you're in a private school, a public school, a homeschool setting. I think those groups matter. But I also think it's most important. Once again, I go back, this is what you're modeling to your children. I
Yeah.
mean, they're sponges. They see what their parents do. And that can be good or bad, right? So, but even if you're an individual, I'll just say this: my parents were not political. I came from a very simple background, but I think I was just kind of wired for it. I mean, I always ran for student council or student body president, or maybe it was because I was very much an extrovert and had a strong opinion. But I know that all of these things, for things to work in a community, need all different types of gifts of people. And I think you just have to look at what your gift is and see, how can I pour that into my community that I love and care about?
Yeah. I think like in conclusion, the last part of this brief in terms of how you can get engaged, it also brings, and we've talked about that, about knowing your local government and understanding how it functions.
Mhm.
Before you really get engaged, you understand who is doing what, because chances are there's probably a task force or a committee that is already in place to address some of the issues or concerns that your problem that you think need to be fixed, and where you could really deploy your talents. The other piece that's interesting here is to develop your financial acumen. You need to kind of follow the money and understand, well, how can things get funded? Because at the end of the day, a lot of times that is could be the barrier or the opportunity for doing change. We had a conversation about bringing financial literacy into the schools, and then, well, you kind of need to understand and be able to understand budgets and functioning, and that's a piece of skill set that is critical, especially for women to develop and be comfortable in a public setting, is building that out. The other one is, and Kim, you touched on that, is knowing how the most vulnerable are assisted in your community.
Mhm.
That's something else that you can really be intentional in saying, well, how are the homeless helped? How are the elderly helped? How are the people with intellectual disabilities, how are they made members of our communities? I think like you can take the veterans, the immigrants, and the welcomers. You can really start looking at the most vulnerable in your communities and how are they made part invited to be productive members of the community. And you need to be intentional, I think, in defining your path to civic engagement to some extent.
Well, and Sylvie, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think for many of us and those folks who might be listening to this, you mentioned our most vulnerable. Those folks need a voice, and oftentimes they don't know how to do it. But you can be that voice for them. And I would also, I want to say to people, don't think you have to know everything. I didn't. I mean, 20 years ago, the only thing I did know is that I knew something needed to change. I knew what was happening was wrong. And the things that I learned through that entire process, not just about filtering technology, but relationships that I built or how politics works and so forth, I learned that. But I think if your heart is in the right place, if you really believe and have a passion towards something, you can make a tremendous difference. You don't have to know everything in order to move forward. I'm continuously a lifelong learner, even at my age. So,
Yeah. And I think if you don't have a passion, and that's the whole idea of the policy circle, is that you discover that the goal is to ignite your leadership that is there within each of us, and discover a path to really have an impact. So, well, thank you, Kim, for being part of this conversation, which I feel is really timely, actually, in the time that we in this COVID time, and inspiring and hopeful. And I hope this will really enrich everyone's participation in their community and going forward. So thank you, Kim. Thank you so
thank
much.
you. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.